today. It is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to focus a lot of time and attention in this first hour on racial reconciliation. And I think you're really going to enjoy the story between Will Ford, who's in studio with me, and Matt Lockett. And it's a story that I've known for some time, and so I thought, well, just in case somebody doesn't know the story, I'll post the article, a good article from our friends at CBN, and tell the story. And I've had all sorts of people around the studio going, I didn't know this story, so I suspect if they didn't, you don't either. So you're going to really be encouraged by that as we talk about this whole issue of racial reconciliation today. But also, these two individuals also very strongly pro-life. So later in the week, as we talk about, of course, Roe versus Wade and the March for Life, well, that will tie into some of the other things they're doing. And that's just the first hour. The second hour, a lot of people are saying, well, how are African Americans going to vote in the 2020 election? So we're going to have Bruce Eberly with us and some others. So we'll talk about that more next hour. But first of all, let me go to my in-studio guest, Will Ford, who I've known of for some time. He is the director and chair of the Marketplace Leadership Major at Christ for the Nations, place in where I've spoken before. He and Matt, who we'll introduce in just a minute, founders of Dreamstream Company. We also have a link to his website as well. And in a few minutes, we're going to talk about this prayer bowl and its significance. But Will, thank you for being with us in studio today.
Kerby, honored to be here. I've been a listener for many years when you and, of course, Marlon Maddox were doing this together years ago. I used to always listen to you guys and still do so. Honored to be here today.
Well, and again, you've benefited quite a bit from some of the things we've talked about here on Point of View, haven't you?
Totally. I mean, I remember you talking about providence and teachings on providence in this kettle pot in my family. We're going to talk about in a second. It comes from Lake Providence. So a lot of those things. And then also the worldview teaching that you used to talk about and other things. This ministry has been invaluable.
Yeah, well, it has been great to have you in studio today, and I'm looking forward to telling this story. But let's finish the other part of the story here.
Yes.
Matt Lockett is the executive director of the Justice House of Prayer, and so you can find that information on our website as well. Also, of course, find Will Ford's ministry. He also oversees Bound for Life International pro-life prayer movement, so we're going to be talking about racial reconciliation, but we're also going to be talking about prayer. And Matt, thank you for joining us today as well here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me on today. It's an honor, and it's good to be with you on a historic day.
Let me, if I can, then come to Will and tell the story. You guys kind of know, as you've told the story, who gets to tell which parts. But you first met Lincoln Memorial, praying for the nation. Right. Tell the rest of the story.
Yeah, what led us to that spot was this 200-year-old kettle pot.
Yes.
It's been in my family. It was used by the slaves in my family. They used it for cooking. They used it for washing clothes, but secretly, it was used for prayer.
Yes.
It was owned by a slave master there in Lake Providence, Louisiana, who would, as the story was told, would beat them for any reason, and praying was one of them, primarily because he didn't want them to get any kind of hope for freedom or any desire for freedom. So if he heard them praying, he would literally beat them. The irony of the peculiar institution, as they called it back then, slavery, is that they wanted slaves to be Christians because they knew that Christian slaves made better workers. Of course, the gospel was perverted, and they would say slaves be obedient to your masters if you want to go to heaven. Now, we know we're saved by grace through faith, not of works. It's a gift of God so that no one should boast. But it was against the law for slaves to read and write. Everybody teach them how to read and write. So they wanted to be Christians, but they didn't want them to pray because they thought they would get hopeful and try to run away. But listen, Kerby, these folks in my family, they were Christians, and they decided to pray anyway. So what they would do is they would have this prayer meeting late at night on that plantation in Lake Providence, Louisiana, and they would take this 200-year-old kettle pot in there with them. That's been passed down to me. And here's the reason why it was passed down. They would sneak into the barn and they would take that pot and turn it upside down on the cabin floor. They would then take 3 or 4 rocks and prop up the edges so it would be suspended off the ground about 1 inch or 2. They would then prostrate themselves on the ground and put their lips in between the opening between the ground and the kettle so that the kettle pot muffled their voices as they prayed through the night. So it just became this acoustic means to keep their prayers muffled, especially if they got too loud. But the story that was passed down with that kettle is this, is that those folks didn't think they would see freedom in their time. So they prayed for the freedom of their children in the next generation. So one day freedom comes as this young teenage girl decides to keep that pot and that story in our family, probably because she's thinking about all those who are dead and gone, who risked their lives to pray for her freedom. And she's probably thinking about all those who are too old to enjoy the freedom she's about to embrace. So she keeps that pot and that story in our family, and she passed it on to Harriet Lockett. Harriet Lockett passed it on to her daughter, Noah Lockett. Noah Lockett passed it on to her son, William Ford Sr., who then passed it on to William Ford Jr., who then gave it to me, William Ford III.
The third.
Yep.
And again, some people might say, I'd like to see this pot.
Right.
And we do have a link to this article at CBN, and you can actually watch the video and see that. I even wondered if you're going to bring it in today, but, again, you can see what that's like. And so that's the first part. Now, Matt, I got to get your part of the story because you hear about this pot. Some people called it a prayer bowl, and that reminds me of Revelation 5, where there's this golden bowl with incense. So you have that connection there. But Matt, tell the rest of the story on your side, and then we'll come back and talk about the connection between the two of you.
Yeah, I didn't know Will at this point in my life, and I had gone through a real difficult time when I lost my father unexpectedly and suddenly. He passed away on January 17th, 2004. And one of the peculiar things about my family is that we had no knowledge of our family history or genealogy. We actually couldn't get past my dad's grandfather because there had been a loss of records, and mainly just people stopped telling the stories. There was no family story. There was no knowledge of where we had come from. And that was saying something for my dad's family because he was one of 16 siblings. And yet none of his generation knew anything about where the Locketts came from. And so after he passed away, I spent the better part of that year just determined to try to find out what my family history was and where did we come from. And I hit all the same problems and roadblocks that all of my cousins had hit in the past. And I got more cousins than I can count. And there was just nothing to be found. And it was during that time that I actually had a dream about what God was wanting to do in America. And that dream led me, and it was a very strange dream. I didn't know what to do with it, but it led me to a prayer meeting at the Lincoln Memorial. Now, I showed up on January 17th, 2005. That was Martin Luther King Day. So this is what we're observing today is the 15th anniversary of that day, where I made my way across the country to go to a prayer meeting, and I didn't understand why. And I showed up on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and that was the first place that Will Ford and I ever came together for the very first time. And I didn't know him. He didn't know me. But later that evening, he was the guest speaker where he brought out that kettle that you were just talking about. And he told the story about his family and this rich heritage of the slaves who prayed for freedom. They prayed for the nation. And I was just weeping because I was listening to this man talk about this rich spiritual heritage in his family. And I had no idea what my family, had done. And so we met and compared notes after the service, and we thought it was kind of peculiar that this kettle had come down through a family with the last name Lockett, same name as me, and but they spelled it differently. They only spelled it with one T. My family spelled it with two.
Yep.
And my Locketts were from Kentucky as best we could figure out, but his Locketts were down in Louisiana. And we just thought it was this amazing coincidence.
Let me jump in real quickly because we have one of those mandatory breaks, and this is going to be a great cliffhanger because I think some people have a pretty good idea where this is going. But we will finish the rest of the story. And if nothing else, what a great illustration of racial reconciliation. And I don't think this was a coincidence. Divine providence we talked about,
yes,
right?
Sir. That's
we'll
right.
be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we have Will Ford in studio, Matt Lockett by phone, and of course telling the story of these two individuals coming together. And Will, let's just, before we go back to Matt, talk about the fact that he had a dream that brought him there.
Yes.
You had a dream that brought you there.
Yeah,
didn't you?
so my friend asked me to bring this kettle pot to this prayer meeting he was having there in Washington, D.C. So we're at the prayer meeting at the Lincoln Memorial first. Mm-hmm. And then that night, I brought the kettle out. But the reason why I was invited to that event was because of a dream that I had about Dr. King.
Yes.
So in the dream, I'm on my way to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. That's where Dr. King started the Civil Rights Movement and where he preached. But in the dream, we're on our way there, but we had to pick up Dr. King first. Right. So it's a dream, right? So we go by this house, and Dr. King is alive. And in the dream, he has this huge white duffel bag with black handles on it. And in the dream, he starts emptying all this dark garbage out of that duffel bag. And he comes to get into this vehicle with me and my friend. And in the dream, I thought to myself, man, that bag would make a nice souvenir. It shows you how caught up I am, right? Even in my dreams, I'm thinking, I went to Morehouse College. Dr. King went to Morehouse College. The bag would make a nice souvenir. So I go to pick up the baggage in the dream, but before I could touch it, Dr. King grabs me by my shoulders in the dream and says, no, do not go back and pick that up. And he starts telling me what I need to do to heal the race issue in our nation. I wake up with tears streaming down my face. My pillow was soaked in tears. I've been weeping in intercession the whole night. I didn't realize it. I was praying, said, God, remind me, what did Dr. King say to me? And the Lord said to me, William, the white bag with the black handles, that would be the interpretation for your dream. And I knew what he's talking about. The black handles represented how eyes of black men have been carrying and handling white baggage. Yeah. And the Lord was saying to me, William, get rid of your white baggage. You've been carrying it for way too long.
Wow.
So in other words, he was saying to me, get rid of any bitterness, rid of any unforgiveness, get rid of any resentment, get rid of any guilt manipulation, get rid of your white baggage so you can get in a new vehicle that can bring revival and justice for everybody.
Good.
So the question God has for us all, especially in the church, is this: what color is our baggage?
Yes.
Whatever it is, get rid of it, because we need each other, because only a united church is going to heal a divided nation.
Matt, let's come back to you, because, of course, you met there at the Lincoln Memorial, and then you guys started traveling around because you were a kindred spirit on everything from prayer to, obviously, the whole idea of racial reconciliation, not to mention the pro-life issue and those. But, Matt, finish the rest of your story here.
You know, when I look back 15 years ago to the night that I met Will, I'm so thankful that the very first thing that we did that night, we were there at the altar. We compared notes that I mentioned earlier about our family name and where we came from. But that first night that we met, Will and I prayed, and I repented on behalf of those who owned slaves, and Will released forgiveness on behalf of slaves. And that was the very first act, and that marked us. You know, I went on to leave the marketplace. I became a full-time missionary in Washington, D.C., and Will and I, for 15 years, we've been running together. We struck up a friendship, probably bigger than that and deeper than that, really a brotherhood and just a profound relationship that we began to run together, began to contend for revival in America, contend for racial healing, and contend for the ending of abortion. And that was the subject of the dream that led me there. But these two things, in the years that would follow, God began to reveal how intertwined those two things are, that of racism and the pro-life issue.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's see if we can talk about, Lockett spelled with one T, Lockett spelled with two T's, but all of a sudden you said, wait a minute, we have a past that connects a lot more than you would have ever imagined. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, I wish it had been all of a sudden. Unfortunately, it was a decade later.
Yes, I know.
Will and I had been running together, doing prayer gatherings all over the country, big ones, small ones, everything in between. And after about 9, almost 10 years later of doing that, we got breakthrough on my family genealogy, and it came with this really curious fact. And what we found out is that the last battle of the American Civil War occurred in my family's front yard.
That's right.
It's called the Battle of Lockett's Farm. There's a historical marker in front of that farmhouse, and it says, "Here Lee fought his last battle," referring to General Lee. And it was just a few miles away at Appomattox Courthouse that he surrendered in 1865. And so we have these really fascinating artifacts. Will has this iron kettle that slaves prayed under for freedom. Me, my family, we literally have the little patch of ground where the war ended that ended slavery in America. And so it wasn't till that discovery came out a decade later that then some pieces started coming together that took it to a whole new level.
Yep. So, Matt, tell them a part about how you actually went to the house and you met the guy who owns the house, and you saw the rest of your family history in there.
Yeah, it was that around that time that my brother had gotten that breakthrough in our genealogy. We learned of this farmhouse, but I hadn't quite connected all the dots yet. I went and visited it because the house has been preserved. And the man that lives there invited me in, and I was shocked when I walked in the living room, and framed and hanging on the wall was the Lockett genealogy. And I had just gotten these details from my brother, and it was a hand in a glove. This was, in fact, my family. And then the man that lived there, he was a little bit of a historian. He began to lay out some of the facts of the Lockett family, and he described how some had left and gone to Kentucky, and that was the only part that we knew about. But he said some went to the deep south and were involved in historical events. But then he said this. He said some left and went to Louisiana. And then he added this little detail. He said, in those handwritten ledgers, sometimes there was a clerical error and they would drop one of the T's and change the spelling of the name. And I was shocked because I'm thinking this can't possibly be true. But I gather all that up and I take it down to Dallas where Will lives, and we just laid it out on a table and kind of stared at it in unbelief and just began to weep over it.
Yeah, so he goes from D.C. to Dallas and lays all this stuff out. So Kerby and my family, I had a genealogist look up my family history back in 2002, and he found this document, 1870, there was this census, and in that census, there were these African-American people living in Lake Providence, Louisiana, on a place called Sutton Plantation, and one of his name was Isaac Lockett.
Isaac Lockett.
And in that census, this black man said that he was 90 years old. So this is 5 years after slavery, so more than likely this is a spot where he was a slave. But in that document, it went on to say that he was originally from Virginia. And there were 3 other Locketts on that same census that were from Virginia. And this genealogist back then always thought that these folks were connected to my other family members. When Matt came back with that, I was, oh my God. So we checked this out. And during that time period, one of the few families that were Locketts in that family, I mean, in that region from Virginia, was Matt's family.
That's right.
And you know how it was back then. Slaves took on the last names of the people who owned them. So This led to another year and a half worth of research. And what we came to discover is this, Kerby, is that it was Matt's family who owned my family, where the kettle pot came from. So think about it. Here's my family praying for the ending of slavery. And then all the way up at the farmhouse of the people who used to own them, slavery comes to an end in their front yard.
Isn't that something?
But then, because he's the God of providence, he's the God of the past and the future, and he loves to heal history as well, he takes 2 members from those same families, Matt and I, weaves our storylines together so that we can war against injustice in our day and cry for awakening in our time, because that's the kind of God we serve. So, but here's the thing that's so beautiful about it. We didn't just learn about that. We also learned about another part of Matt's family history, too, that was really significant. He had a family member that his name was Napoleon Lockett and Mary Lockett. They were like the Southern Belle aristocrats from like the Garden with the Wind types. Mm-hmm. And he was a colonel for the Confederacy, very learned man, a lawyer. He owned hundreds of slaves. Between he and his 11 children, owned maybe close to 1,000 slaves. But his wife, Mary, didn't like the fact that the Confederate White House didn't have its own flag. So she hired a designer
to get the flag.
Yep, yeah. And she hand sewed the Confederate flag in her house and hand delivered it to her friend Jefferson Davis. In other words, Matt's family was, quote unquote, the Betsy Ross for the Confederacy. But isn't it interesting that through the same family where the flag of rebellion was raised up in our country, because of the prayers of Christian slaves and white Christian abolitionists, through that same family, where the flag of rebellion was raised up, the flag of surrender goes up in their front yard because of prayer. And I think God is bringing us all to another great surrender. And there's a little bit more information about our family we're going to talk about in a second.
We need to go to one of those mandatory breaks, but if you haven't already gone, this is more than just a coincidence. The last battle of the Civil War on the front yard of the Lockett family that also were the ones that created the Confederate flag. Mm-hmm. And then these 2 individuals, Will Ford and Matt Lockett, become the best of friends, speak all over the country on racial reconciliation, and all of that happened 15 years ago today. So I just thought it would be kind of fun for you to hear that story. And if you think we have more, oh yes, we have much more. And if you'd like to read about this, I've posted the article from CBN, but you can read some others on their website. All of it available at the website pointofview.net. We've got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about racial reconciliation. The article we've posted here, God is Shouting. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. 2 men meet in a divine moment. We know that. Discover a shared past that will blow you away. So we've posted that on the website. But in addition to that, we have a link to willfordministries.com. So if people would like to have you come and share this story, speak about racial reconciliation, talk about the pro-life movement, all sorts of things happen in the African-American community, that's the way they can contact you, right?
That's one way to contact me. And then for Matt and I together, we have a shared website, dreamstreamcompany.com or dreamstreamco.com. Facebook.com for whatever reason. It's down right now. It's never been down in 2 years, but that's how you can find both of us, where we come together and we share our story together. We've been doing that around the country and around the world. It's on international now. So yeah.
And I might mention that we have both your Twitter feed as well as your Facebook post. We also have the Twitter feed and Facebook post for Matt Lockett, and also information about the Justice House of Prayer, Matt, so people can contact you as well, can't they?
Yes, we've been going for 15 years on Capitol Hill. Got a prayer room and a community of prayer here in D.C., but also we mobilize a pro-life prayer movement around the nation.
So again, let's, if we can, Will, for just a minute, talk about traveling around speaking. Then you find out that his family owned your family.
Yeah.
And for a while, that was a real struggle for you, was it not?
Well, at first, because we're guys in the prayer movement, we like these uncoincidental coincidences. And first it was like all wowies out. We're like, oh my God, this is so great. Look what God has done. And then when this world kind of started dying down after about 4 months, we kind of went, dude, your family owned my family.
Yeah.
And so we had these moments where we had to actually work through this. The beautiful thing is that we had a conciliatory relationship before that for 10 years, right? People talk about reconciliation, but you need conciliation first, right? So I had these moments where I had to get rid of my baggage. I had to forgive. And now I had a face connected to those stories passed down to my family. We had stories passed down about slaves being beat to death from our family.
For going fishing.
For going fishing without asking, stuff like that. And now this face that's connected to it is one that's connected to somebody that I love is Matt. And I love him. I love his family. We've done Thanksgiving together, all that. So I had to deal with those issues in my heart. And for him, it was hard for him as well, too.
Yeah, let's, if we can, Matt, for just a minute, hear from your side, because all of a sudden you say, wait a minute, my ancestors owned his ancestors, and they beat these individuals, and they had to hide in order just even to pray to the God of salvation. And so what are your reactions at that time?
Well, you can imagine, after listening to this story for almost a decade, to then finding out that my direct connection to it is to that of the slave owner, like that was really hard. That was hard to swallow. It's hard to understand and process. But beyond that, what was happening is that I'm not just describing like a shaming kind of association. There's, I believe, not for everybody, but for some, if not many, white Americans, there is an inability to identify with the pain of the African American community and the challenges that they face. And it's easy to talk about it in theory and to talk about, dare I say it, those people, we just can't identify with it. Suddenly now this is hitting me right in the face. I'm being confronted by it, only it's not theory anymore. What I'm listening and considering is coming from the face of someone that I know and that I love. And I'm so thankful to God that he gave me 10 years to work out a relationship with this man. See, I love Will. I love his family. I fight for his dreams, and he fights for mine. And I kind of think that's how this stuff's supposed to work, that it's only from that kind of a foundation that we can truly begin to process the pain of the past and understand where God wants us to go in the future.
Yeah. Will, how do we deal with this? Because I know you speak a lot in churches, and a lot of pastors say, I still feel there is a lot of division in America, and I don't know how to begin to address that. Talk about that.
For me, my playbook for all this has been 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 25 to 27, where it says, but the Lord's bondservant must be gentle, patient when wrong. Well, let me back up. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome.
Yes.
But must be gentle, patient when wronged, able to instruct. So we need to know our stuff, able to instruct so that those who are in opposition may repent and come to their senses and escape the snare of Satan, who's taken them captive to do his will. In other words, we first must come to the point that where we realize we're the Lord's bondservant and not anybody else's or any other agenda, even political agenda. And we have to become better listeners, not be quarrelsome. And if we're really going to do this right, we need to know our stuff regarding some of these issues, and we got to become better listeners. And at the same time, get to a place where we focus on winning hearts and not arguments.
Yes.
And that's what's going to happen. So we have to bear fruit and speak truth, but stay at the table. And that's what both sides need to do in this hour, stay at the table.
Matt, speak to that issue as well. The idea of listening, as you just said a minute ago, and not making excuses, certainly are things that I know you're going to say, but help us out. You two have been traveling for some time, and people right now in church leadership are saying, okay, what can I do to heal the divisions in America?
Well, I think that there is definitely a shift in the culture that we're living through right now, where probably there is more awareness and desire to bring authentic change to the racial division in America than ever before, even during the civil rights movement. I believe that more Americans right now want to see this thing dealt with. But as Will said, it's so easy to fall into this trap of offense. Somebody said something and I don't like it. And it really is. It's a snare. It's a trap. And I think what God has done, if I could just be so humble to say this, that I believe what God is doing with Will and I in revealing this story right now is just this foundational element of relationship and love, and honestly caring and wanting the best for one another. If we can actually come to the table with that, then I think that'll keep us at the table. I think that we do need to listen. I think we need to identify as best we can with the challenges that others face, and not just come with a presumptuous attitude that we've already, got this figured out, and, you just need to do this or you just need to do that. No, we actually need to listen to each other, and we need to begin to take on each other's struggles. I don't know if that makes sense, but this is what Will and I have done for 15 years, is we've taken up each other's struggles. We've taken up each other's concerns, and his battles are my battles. And I really do think that's a model for where the culture needs to shift to.
Yeah.
When you talk about the table, I was just thinking that you met at the Lincoln Memorial. Yeah. Of course, there's the very famous speech, I Have a Dream speech. But remember what Dr. King said, that the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners, I think I have one of each right here, right now, will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood.
Exactly.
I mean, in some respects, I know that wasn't meant to be a prophecy, but it did end up being very prophetic, didn't it?
We think it was more than poetry. We also think it was prophecy. Matt, why don't you tell them about Lucy Lockett?
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier, it was hard to find out that my connection was to that of the slave owner. But, once, God let us kind of sit there for about a year and a half with that reality, that my family owned Will's family, and Will and I worked through some of those issues related to that. But then God took me a little bit deeper, and what I discovered is that there was another member in my family. See, after slavery ended, there was a former slave trying to teach her young son how to read and write right there on the Lockett plantation. And in one night walks Lucy Lockett, one of my ancestors, and she catches them red-handed. See, they were doing it in secret because even after the war, it still wasn't very popular for former slaves to learn how to read and write. And so in that moment, something happened. There could have been consequences, but instead, Lucy looks at the mother and says, no, what you've chosen to do is very wise. And she actually takes up tutoring this young boy in how to read and write. And we know that story because he recorded it in his autobiography. That young boy was Robert Russell Moton. He went on to become president of Tuskegee Institute. He actually replaced
so good.
He replaced Booker T. Washington, and then in 1922, he gave the dedication speech of the Lincoln Memorial where Will and I met.
Yeah, so 41 years later, after Moton does that dedication speech, Dr. King does I Have a Dream speech, then 41 years later, Matt and I meet there in a prayer meeting at the very spot where Dr. King said in his I Have a Dream speech, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit together at the table of brotherhood. So, yeah, Matt had slave owners in his family and also had abolitionists in his family, too. So in all of our families, we have these things called generational curses and generational blessings. It represent these dominating themes or storylines. And what God is shouting to America right now is this: what storyline do we want to be a part of?
Which storyline?
The healing of the hurt, the blessing of the curse. What storyline are we going to be a part of?
We'll take a break. Back for a few more minutes. In studio with me today, Will Ford. I think you really enjoy the story. Matt Lockett by phone. And I thought for just a minute, I want to move from not only this idea of slavery, which was the great social ill and evil of the 19th century, to the great social ill and evil of the 20th century, and that is abortion. And that's another thing that draws you together because, again, if you can devalue individuals, Dred Scott, you can devalue individuals, Roe versus Wade.
Exactly.
And Will, I want you to speak to that. I know Matt certainly is an individual that oversees Bound for Life International, but I want to hear from both of you because not only are we talking about Martin Luther King Day today, but we're talking about March for Life and Roe versus Wade as well, aren't we?
Yeah, we really are. I mean, the litmus test for authentic revival during those days when the slavery was going on was, of course, the ending of slavery. Today, the litmus test for authentic revival to me would be the ending of abortion. Yes. That's true. And a lot of people don't understand how intricately interwoven racism is connected to that from eugenics and everything else. Easy way to back into it. Years ago, around 1905, 1906, there was a young man named Odabinga. He actually was, there in the Bronx Zoo. He was there in the Bronx Zoo.
I know the story.
You know the story, right? Yeah. So, but he was in Africa first. He was what we would call an animal whisperer, and really good with training and talking to animals or whatever. So there was a person from the Eugenics Society, and for those who don't know what a eugenist is basically eugenics is just basically a sophisticated name for racism. They believe that populations grow geometrically and food supplies grow arithmetically. So in other words, they think at some point in time there's not going to be enough food for the people they deserve to be here. So they try to proliferate the race or the eugenic people that
get rid of the unfit races.
Get rid
Margaret
of the
Sanger and people like that.
Yeah, Margaret Sanger and all those folks were thinking like that. Anyway, so this man from the Eugenics Society sees Odabinga, brings him to the World's Fair, puts him on display with monkeys to try to say that
as a missing link.
To say that black folks are closer to monkeys on the evolutionary scale. But Madison Grant, who was over the Bronx Zoo, he thought, you know what, he'd be a great person to put on display as a social Darwin kind of experiment. So they put him on display. Over 40,000 people a weekend would come to see Odabinga in a cage with this orangutan. And eventually they let him out, but he was so messed up mentally and emotionally, he committed suicide. But here's the thing. A lot of people don't realize Madison Grant was the man who wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race. It was the first book on scientific racism. And that book was read by Hitler. Of course, he was big into eugenics. And the other person who told everybody to read that book was Margaret Sanger. Who is she? She's the person who founded Planned Parenthood. Yes. Where more than 70% of those clinics are in minority communities. And she had this whole agenda to control the population of the people that she thought didn't deserve to be here. And one of those populations were the population of black folks. So all that to say, this thing is way more intricately connected than people realize. And the race issue goes down to that. Margaret Sanger also was the voice behind mass incarceration, because if you can't keep them from being born through sterilization and abortion, well, then let's just sequester them away from the rest of society. So she was huge on institutionalization and also mass incarceration for that reason. So these things are all connected way more than people realize. Because the deal is this. Some people say Black Lives Matter. I get where they're coming from to a degree. All lives matter. I probably more identify with that. But God is saying, drill down deeper. Life matters. Life matters. And when the people that you cannot see, talking about the child in the womb, can be dehumanized to the place of becoming an option, it's inevitable that some of the people that we can see can also be dehumanized even to the place of elimination. So life matters. God is trying to get us to drill down deeper to that.
And Matt, I want to hear from you because I know you've got a real heart for the life movement. And of course, the Bound for Life and other things is not a protest, it's a prayer meeting. And you certainly call for people to pray about this issue of abortion and life, don't you?
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of activism on the ground for 47 years, but our part of our piece of the puzzle is that God has called us to mobilize prayer. And for these last 15 years, we've been contending primarily for a transformation of the courts in America. But here we are, this Wednesday, we'll be crossing another tragic milestone, 47 years of legalized abortion in America since Roe v. Wade. And the number that they're quoting now is that represents 61 million lives lost since 1973. You've already said it, that if we can devalue human life, then we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Nobody can say anything about it. And I think that's where we want to be very careful that we don't send a message that to anybody listening to your program today, we're not conflating, we're not borrowing interest from that of slavery and using it for the pro-life movement. We're saying that these things are intricately intertwined. It's not a conflation to associate these two.
Totally.
What we're saying is it's a value system that if we can devalue human life, then that opens the door for slavery and that opens the door for abortion, because there's no right or wrong. You can do whatever you want with another human life. And so this is where we're at right now. People said that slavery was settled law, but then God sent a revival that broke that in the heart of the nation. And I believe that's what's happening right now. People want to, the pro-abortion proponents, they want to say that Roe v. Wade is settled law, but it's not. That may be the law in the books right now, but if you look at America, the tide has turned. It is anything but settled in the hearts of people. And I believe we're on the verge of a great revival that's going to break this, just like it did with Dred Scott and slavery.
And again, I might just mention my commentary today is, of course, on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and also on the letter from the Birmingham jail. And, of course, the argument from Dr. King was that a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law, but an unjust law is one that is out of harmony with the moral law. We know that slavery, Dred Scott, abortion, Roe versus Wade, those were out of harmony with the moral law. So that's material as well. And I'm just about out of time, and I just know right now, first of all, Will and Matt, there are all sorts of people saying, okay, how do I contact these people? I want them to come to my church. I want them to come to my civic group. I want them to come to my gathering. And, Will, how can people work with you and maybe invite you to come and speak, or to have both of you come and speak?
Yeah, well, I would suggest first check out our book, The Dream King, How the Dream of Martin Luther King is Being Fulfilled to Heal Racism in America. You can get that on Amazon.
Right.
You can get it other places where books are sold. Check out our website. For whatever reasons, it's down right now, but it'll be up in just a second. DreamStreamCo.com. And you can check me out at willfordministries.com.
And Matt, if people might want to have you come and speak to their prayer ministry, maybe speak to their pro-life ministry, those kinds of things, again, we'll have connections to Dreamstream Company, but we also have a link as well to Justice House of Prayer. Matter of fact, if they make their way to Washington, D.C.,
yes.
I always tell them to go to the Museum of the Bible, and they need to go and spend some time praying with you, right?
That's exactly right.
Yes, sir. That would be great. We would love that.
So, again, those are some resources that we have on the website. And if some of our listeners say, this was really good, I want to hear it again, we will post that for ourselves. I suspect you'll put it up there as well. But if you go to our website, pointofview.net, there's a button there that says listen. So that means you could download the podcast and you could send it to someone else. Maybe you're thinking about this issue of racial reconciliation. You're thinking of this issue of life. Or you just say, this is the most incredible story I've ever heard. I've got to pass this on to my friends. Then click on the button that says listen. Or you can go to watch. Of course, we've already put it up on satellite. We've also put it on Facebook Live, but soon it will be on Facebook. And so you will find it there. And I guess it's already on Facebook, but soon it'll be on YouTube. So then you'll have access to that. And I would encourage you to pass it on to some others. And if nothing else, maybe you will invite Will and Matt to come and share their story again. And Will, it's just great to have you in studio.
It's such an honor to be here. I've been geeking out the whole time. I'm just starstruck, being around you, Kerby, and honored to be here on Point of View today.
And Matt, I need to say hi to you next time I'm in Washington, D.C., shake your hand, but thank you for joining us as well.
Thank you so much, Kerby. It was great to be with you today.
We're going to take a break.